So we have these practices of reason giving, and it seems like sometimes we can stand back from them, and we can then sort of give reasons for whether they're good practices of reason giving. So you could look, for example, at the reasons that were given for going to war in Iraq, for example, perhaps determine they weren't very good reasons. What is the standpoint from which you can offer those kinds of evaluations of the practices? Always being located in other sorts of practices, so that reason is ultimately always going to be in some sort of cultural context, some social context. Is that the way in which you're able to always offer those, or is there some? I mean, you don't want to be. I take it you don't want to be saying there's sort of some sort of view from nowhere from which you can deliver these judgments, correct judgments about whether the reason-giving practices are good reason-giving practices or not. Right? You want to stick with a kind of social. I take it from what you said that you want to stick with this sort of thoroughgoing social practice grounded conception of what reason ultimately is. Is that right? Is that your view about how to think about reasoning and the assessments of sort of schemes of reason giving?
Yeah. I was pretty open when I started. For example, I made a distinction between reason as a noun, the way it's kicked around the noun, reasoning, the way it works in the various, but also as a noun sometimes, rationality, or the rational, and bracketing all these things also from things like rationalism or idealism. So I worked through that. I must admit that there were many moments, too many moments in the beginning where I wasn't even sure that was what I was doing, but I think I was looking for something like what you said, something from, if not from nowhere, then from everywhere. And it took me a long time to find that that desire itself is implicated in the process itself. And so the question of legitimation becomes an issue. I looked at biology, I looked at the works that the Churchlands are doing in California, for example, the works that Danny Dennett does, but also things like there's this thing they do MRI now, where you could scan the brain and really look at what's going on there. Rutgers, they do a lot of that. So I did look there too. I looked at the psychological studies of IQs going back to 1914 with that Pearson thing on the G factor. So I did look. I guess I'm trying to admit to you. I hope it doesn't sound as naive as I'm saying, but I was looking for either in those terms I made, whether in reason, for example, I tried to find it in places, and in the end, there's no way that I could. I had no ground to stand to talk that way, and because I didn't see ground, I couldn't see ground, and I couldn't see available the language to. So I was just happy then to say, don't look anymore for grounds, and don't look for that kind of language to match the ground that you're not sure exists anyway. Just look at practices, and I think. But our practices are so rich because once you then look at it, you see all those things you mentioned, culture, you see history, and more importantly, you see time, which I just really think that's a category that has not been taught out very well. Phenomenology has done some of that, but not really in an intelligible way, at least in an intelligible way that I can see. Was that what I was doing? I was admitting that I tried to do that, and I told you I wasn't happy with the outcome.
We take a couple of questions. Personally, you want to follow up on that? Kind of, yes. Personal follow-up, and then we'll go there, and then the final question will be there. No, go ahead. Okay. You were dancing, so.
When you're thinking about social practices of reason giving, and then when you use the phrase the post-colonial vernacular, I was thinking of a kind of different body of literature maybe than this sort of big terrain that you're working with. And when I think of that quote from Wittgenstein from the investigations that you read, even physics gives me grounds, right, for acting in a certain way. Imagine a people who consult an oracle. Wittgenstein, in his sort of typically goofy, not very politically savvy kind of voice seems to be saying, well, imagine a people who consult an oracle. You know, one might be able to think of them as equally rational to someone who grounds his practices in beliefs about physics. But of course, there's not really an equality between those two groups of people because of their different situation in history, as you suggested. And even though it's an entirely imagined people who consult an oracle, there is this kind of aura of the primitive or the tribal that attaches to that example that he remains pretty much oblivious to, I think. And so in my seminar that I'm teaching at the moment on the politics of embodiment, we just read that chapter in Fanon where he talks about the famous chapter in Black Skin, White Masks. So he talks about the lived experience of the black man. And I think my students had mostly trained in analytic philosophy, I have to say, had a hard time figuring out what Fanon's argument was, because he goes around and around with the idea of reason. But he has the anecdote of being on the train, and there's a drunken white guy in the corner of the train carriage who insults him, right? Him, a black man in the train in France. And he says, you know, I tried using reason on this guy, and he wasn't interested, right? He wasn't interested in my education, he wasn't interested in any of these things I had to bring to this social practice of reason giving that, you know, I thought that the reasons that he ought to be committed to as a white French citizen, but, you know, he didn't care. He just saw me through this lens of racial imminence. And then he goes through his different attempts, right, to be seen as the man of reason and why they fail. And then his attempt to embrace a kind of irrationality and the references to the negritude movement. And at the end of it all, he just says, I explode, right, that I cannot, in the face of this inconsistent, incomprehensible rejection of the very practices that European culture thought it had embraced, I just cannot see any way to proceed, or at least that's one interpretation of what he means when he says he explodes. And so I just wondered how you sort of engage that piece of historicity that seems to me to be central to reading examples like Wittgenstein's and to understanding experiences like the one that Fanon described.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question, and I'll be brief so that you get to. I mean, I really see that. You see, thinking historically here, I think that the institutions of the Enlightenment did a lot to not just project the kind of expectation, to project the kind of social horizons, but also the social instruments that allowed Fanon to have that kind of expectation. And so what implicit in my argument is that if everywhere or too many places, not just Fanon, is not going to be to explode, we have to be aware of these heritages and ask ourselves, yeah, because I mean you could see metaphorically, I mean you could see cultures or societies exploding just like Fanon because they can't figure it out, and that brings us to the question that if I had kept looking for reason, you know, somewhere, so I will miss all this that's going on, and I'm not happy to. I didn't know. By the way, I read from the 20th century Wittgenstein, and then there was the 17th century Zarekov, and it's clear to me that we're faced with a different century. So Wittgenstein is just as dated for me as Zarekov was, and I would just insist on the post-colonial.
Two final questions. Edward?
Thank you very much. I have a question, but before that, it's also based on this whole issue of relativism. And if we take, in terms of language or culture, within every language or culture, if we take this to be relative, in the sense that truth or falsehood or rightness or wrongness is culturally or language is contextual in terms of language or culture. I think